All right. Good morning. Bon dia. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Jacob Koch, and I work for the Sustainability, Climate, and Resilience team for Bloomberg Associates. We are part of Mike Bloomberg's philanthropy, and we work as pro bono or philanthropic consultants to mayors and city governments across the US and around the world. And I've had the great pleasure to work on some food policy work together with the city of Milan, city of Paris, city of Atlanta, and the city of Detroit. Very excited to be joined by some representatives from some excellent US cities today. So we don't have a ton of time, so just to give you the run of show, we're gonna really sort of focus on two topics related to the theme of the conference around food justice. And so hope to give you a sense of how these US cities are thinking about and using wording, language around equity and justice in their food policy work, and then also talk a little bit about how the pandemic and the conditions and the emergency conditions of the pandemic did or did not change or affect the way that these cities have been doing their food policy work. And then hopefully, depending upon time, we will aim to leave some time for some questions from you all in the audience as well. So I'm just gonna go ahead and pass it over and allow our speakers to introduce themselves. And we'll ask you to give your name, your title, where you work in your city, how long you've been in your role. Maybe just tell us a little bit about your professional background, and then maybe just one piece of what you're working on related to food policy. So Ruby, maybe begin with you. Thank you.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ruby Ferguson, and I'm the Food Equity Policy Lead in the city of Chicago. I've been in this role for about a year, and I'm the first person to ever be in this role in Chicago, which is pretty exciting. And I have the honor of staffing Chicago's Food Equity Council. So it's a council that's looking at Chicago's entire food system and how we can reimagine that food system into one that's more just and equitable. So it has 4 working groups across the food system, and I'll dive into that more. But that's a little bit of what I do.
Thanks, Ruby. Taylor.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks to Jacob and Bloomberg Associates for hosting this session. I'm Taylor Lefebvre. I'm the Chief of Food Policy and Planning for the City of Baltimore, our food policy and planning team sits in the city's Department of Planning. So our food policy and planning division, which is myself, 3 food planners, and 2 fellows, oversees the Baltimore Food Policy Initiative, which is a 3-tiered strategy focusing on government, community organizations, and our city's residents. And we go about our work through interagency collaboration across the city, our Food Policy Action Coalition, and our resident food equity advisors. And I think probably later I'll get into some of the things that we're working on, but for the last few years, we've been pretty much 100% focused on our city's COVID-19 emergency food response, and now we're transitioning into several programs that we are implementing through American Rescue Plan Act funding. I guess I can briefly touch on a little bit of background. I have a master's in urban planning focused on environmental planning and food policy, and always just wanted to work in the intersection of sort of food planning and policy. But there's, still even now, there's still not many opportunities to do that working for city governments in the United States. But I guess lucky enough for me, I happen to be living in Baltimore and already working for the city in a different role when our team added a new position of food systems planner. And so I was brought on right at the beginning of the pandemic in April of 2020 for that role. And I never actually really ended up doing anything that role was supposed to be doing, because I was just focused on COVID-19. And then this past January, so a little less than a year ago, I became the Chief of Food Policy and Planning.
Thanks. Latha.
Hi, I'm Latha Swami. I'm the Director of Food Policy for the City of New Haven, Connecticut. And I've been in this role just over 4 years. It's a very new division. It was just created in 2016. And it actually sits in the Human Services Department, which is a unique positioning for people in roles like ours in municipal government in the U.S., but it was a strategic move to ensure that that position was even created in the government. And so with the administration at the time, that's where they felt comfortable putting it. And I focus on mainly systems level work and root cause solutions to some of the things that we see downstream. So rather than, or in addition to supporting already the amazing work that's happening in New Haven through local partners around, directly supporting food security initiatives and things like that, we actually focus on people-driven policy making. So actually taking a grassroots approach to developing, like literally drafting policies and changing zoning ordinances and supporting anti-racist policy making that actually involves the people that it's impacting. And yeah, so kind of the upstream versus the down, or in addition to the downstream and more so the upstream.
Thanks. And Lathan, maybe to stay with you, in your work, you have a very values and vision-driven approach to food policy in New Haven. So could you tell us a little bit about some of the language that you use to talk about that and how that informs? And I'd also love to hear a little bit about how your residents and community members respond to or sort of react to the kinds of language and terminology you use. And just for all of you, equity is a word that has now become very commonly used across the United States to drive this kind of work as well as other policies across municipal government. But I know for some of you that come from outside the U.S., that word isn't as well used or as commonly used outside. So I thought hopefully some of this conversation is interesting to talk about some of the language that we're using around this work.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and even just to kind of briefly make note of being very values driven in our division. And it's me and one other person, Kimberly Acosta, and the way that we work is from our values. And for example, the two of us, have different lived experiences and backgrounds. For me, I actually went to medical school first and was doing a PhD in neuroscience and then went to environmental school. So I actually bring all of that experience and knowledge into the way that I frame food policy work. And so, health equity, socioeconomic justice, environmental justice are all important. And in the framing of, for example, let's say when I first started, people were very focused on the terminology of food security. And to me and, the team, it always evokes kind of this focus on downstream work. So again, like food distribution, kind of the finding ways to improve people's individual lives at that moment, which is very, very important. We, in the division, frame our operating framework. We say that we work from a place of food justice, and now we're trying to socialize the terminology of like food sovereignty in New Haven a bit more, because our team also takes a very global perspective. We are a small city. We have no more than 140,000 residents. And we just, again, based on our experiences, have this very global perspective, are very moved by food sovereignty movements around the world that informs how we want to approach the work. And so we understand that from the residents. This is what residents are actually asking for, envisioning for the community in New Haven. And I think the terminology is very important because food sovereignty brings agency back to every resident. So, they have the power and the ability to have community ownership over what the food system looks like. It's not me just facilitating what I think and then getting a little checkbox because I talked to 3 residents. It's more so they tell me exactly what they want, and my team has specific expertise in policy. They have expertise in beekeeping or expertise in navigating their community and where they've been living for decades and generationally. So it's really focused on the people-driven kind of policy making and community ownership and just distributing the power and democratizing the way that we have processes that develop those food policies.
Thank you. So Ruby, equity is in your job title, and was an important moment for the city of Chicago to create this position, create the Food Equity Council. So can you tell us a little bit about what sort of food equity means in Chicago and why was such an important step for the city and the broader sort of food community in Chicago to take?
Yeah. So I think when we talk about food, it's so important to acknowledge the power dynamics that exist in our food systems. And in America, that typically shows up as racism and poverty. And so a lot of times when we're talking about food access, those might not be an apparent part of the conversation, right? And so the Food Equity Council is really rooted in, yes, people need food, but as we're reimagining that food system, how can we make sure that communities that have a history of disinvestment are part of the change, right? Like that are getting the wealth generation that comes from food businesses or from solutions, so that way we are kind of breaking the cycle of poverty. And so I think semantics are so important, especially because it's not the Food Inequity Council, but it's really coming from this place of abundance. And a lot of times when people do this type of work, they kind of think of what communities lack and not how we can build on the assets that exist in community. And so this is really focused on people have been pushing for this kind of work in Chicago for a long time. And so let's not say that we're reinventing the wheel, but let's acknowledge these community leaders who've been doing for their community when the city has not, and uplift their work and build on those assets so that way we can create a more just and equitable food system.
Thank you. And Taylor, in Baltimore, you guys also talk a lot about food equity, and that's some of the language you use, and you have ambassadors that are part of your team and really this sort of interface between you and communities and residents. So you tell us a little bit about how sort of equity drives your food policy work in Baltimore?
Sure. I would start by saying Baltimore has a very long history of segregation, redlining, and injustice or unjust access to many things in neighborhoods across our city, but particularly food. And that coming out of the uprising from Freddie Gray's murder in 2015, our Department of Planning had a very intentional and deliberate process of creating an equity statement for the entire department that guides our work. I admittedly don't have it memorized word for word, so I won't try to give it to you right now, but basically we use that equity lens specifically in our food policy and planning work and in anything that we do. And we have some of you that are more familiar with the U.S. may be aware that Baltimore has what is often referred to as a black butterfly. So the predominantly black impoverished neighborhoods of the city look like a butterfly on a map. And our team does a lot of food equity mapping to identify what we call healthy food priority areas, what many may refer to as food deserts. And unsurprisingly, the healthy food priority map, anytime we update it, almost exactly looks like a map of the black butterfly. So that, yeah, we use the term, getting to terms that are used, I would say we use the terms that we're working towards food equity, but also food access. We also, as we're working we have a lot of vacant land in our city, and so we do have a lot of urban agriculture and opportunities for more urban agriculture, but there's a lot of issues with getting our farmers land tenure on city-owned land and funding for infrastructure. So we do use the term food sovereignty specifically around urban agriculture. And then real quickly getting to what Jacob was alluding to, we've had for many years now resident food equity advisors. So these are, we've had 3 cohorts and we'll soon be having a 4th. These are a group of residents specifically from healthy food priority areas across the city that we work with for a 6-month usually process, and they are paid for their time. And then what's really important is that their time with us is very intensive, and it's a lot. We're just there to listen to them. It results in their suggested recommendations for us to implement, and then that is what our team then focuses on to implement through policy and planning.
Thanks. I'd like to focus on that just for a minute because I think this is a real sort of emerging best practice in cities across the United States. You know, they're talking about paying residents for their time and energy and work and contribution to this work. LaFa as well as this community advisory board that's guiding a lot of the work in New Haven, and those people are paid for their time. And that's something that is not traditionally done in the United States. We ask residents to give a lot of their time and energy to public processes, to policy making, to feedback, and that does a number of things, including, you know, not allow people who don't have that time to give to be able to participate in the process. And so I think, you know, it's interesting and I think notable to me that food is one of the ways that city governments are changing the paradigm of how they engage with communities and how they engage with residents. And that's a really important thing that a lot of cities across the United States, I think, are really trying to do more of. It's not always easy to be able to get that funding, to be able to figure out, you know, mechanically how to be able to compensate residents, but it's a really, really important step. Ruby?
I was just going to say that it connects a lot of what we said, where it's, you know, by valuing people's time, just for talking to us, it redefines what knowledge is because, you know, they're providing valuable knowledge. It literally gives us the, you know, substance for the work that we say that we're doing. And so, you know, just because, you know, someone's called a consultant doesn't mean that their time is more valuable than residents. So, for example, in the board that we have in New Haven where we are paying residents, in the grant, it's a federal grant that's funding that, but we specifically, framed it where we said these are consultants, and we've listed people as neighborhood experts, urban farming experts, youth experts, and community health experts. And there are residents that are from disinvested neighborhoods, most of them have experience with incarceration, mostly people of the global majority, and it's a way to elevate that residents not only define solutions, but they define the issues too. So it's the full. They are the ones driving and defining the entire process, not just coming in at the end and doing that checkbox thing where you're like, oh, I talked to the 3 residents and that's what they said, and they totally support what I made up in my head alone in an office in City Hall.
Yeah, it's so important. So the next topic that I want to move us to is the pandemic and how that, you know, did or did not change your work. And we've been talking, you know, LaFon particularly been talking about sort of upstream, downstream, you know, sort of which part of the system are you intervening on. And in many cases, you all are talking about, you know, aiming to take a systems approach and think about upstream and the root causes of why someone might not have access to fresh and healthy food. The pandemic was this unprecedented emergency situation, and many of you all were called to do different things in your job than what you had necessarily set out to do. So maybe, Ruby, beginning with you, if you could tell us a little bit about how the pandemic impacted your work, what changed, what didn't, and then now sort of moving forward, how it's shaping what you're working on.
Yeah, so like I mentioned before, Chicago did not have someone focused on food in the mayor's office on the policy team prior to the pandemic. And so in 2020, a lot of food leaders from across the city were getting together to do as what most of us were doing, which was emergency food responses. But they realized that there was this opportunity, that there were eyes on our food system in a way that there hadn't been before. And so when we kind of opened this forum, we talked about political will, and there was a lot of political will in how do we fix this and how do we move forward. And so instead of doing the elaborate planning process that typically happens where you like convene a whole bunch of community members again and say, what should we do? These leaders took existing plans that have already been made for Chicago, said, let's identify what are near-term priorities that we can activate, and let's move forward in a way that's transparent and accountable. And so that led to me being hired and us creating a food equity council that drives this short-term food equity agenda. So there are 5 priorities across the food system that we're thinking about, and only one of them is focused on emergency food. And that's really an acknowledgement that if Chicagoans are reliant on food pantries, we have failed them. That is not a resilient food system. That is not a sustainable model. And so we are looking at how do we reduce barriers to urban agriculture? How do we support BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and people of color owned businesses so that the food businesses that we're creating in communities are an ecosystem of community, right? We're looking at institutional procurement and the implementation of the Good Food Purchasing Program. So how can we leverage the dollars that our schools or our support services spend, so that way our food system is in these like values that we're striving towards. And so I think this was a huge shift. Like, even sometimes with our mayor, I have to remind her that, like, this is not food pantry work, right? Like we're thinking about systems change.
And you technically work in part for the food pantry in Chicago.
It's very interesting. So I actually am an employee of the food bank detailed to the mayor's office, which makes it even more confusing for everyone because they see a food bank emailing them talking about urban ag, and they're like, what's happening here? And I have to do a long explanation like this of what is my role. But I think that shows the commitment that Chicago is acknowledging that we cannot continue to rely on food pantries and that this is inequitable.
Thanks. Taylor, you were talking in some of our prep conversations about the pandemic had some impacts and some changes in where your funding was coming from and where sort of money was available to do some of your work. So tell us a little bit about Baltimore and how the pandemic changed and where that's directing you now.
Sure. Yeah, so I'd say the pandemic completely changed our team's work. Prior to the pandemic, and keep in mind, I wasn't, as you already know, wasn't a part of the team then, but we were primarily like a policy and planning shop. We did have some grant funding, did have about $150,000 a year in city funds to give out as grants to community organizations across the city working on the food system. But we were not like logistics folks or on the ground implementing things, doing contracts and invoices. But there was nobody else in the city that when COVID hit that was going to create and even manage a emergency food response. So it fell to our little team of 4 folks. So as a result of that, we, for a period of 2 years, managed an emergency food response that totaled almost $40 million in spending, and we distributed over 1.7 million boxes of food. And I will say one part of that is that early on we were distributing shelf-stable food from our food bank, and heard we got feedback from resident food equity advisors and from the over 100 community organizations that we were working with that folks didn't want shelf-stable food. They wanted fresh produce. So we quickly shifted to providing boxes of fresh produce on a weekly basis, and ended up distributing about 180 million servings of fresh fruits and vegetables in our healthy food priority areas. And as a result of that, we were able to leverage that experience and that data to receive $11 million of American Rescue Plan Act funding. And so now we're in the process of implementing 5 programs, things such as farmers market incentives, online SNAP, which in the United States often is referred to as food stamps, but for folks to purchase fruits and vegetables through online SNAP and have them delivered directly to their homes.
Which was something that generally wasn't available before the pandemic, right?
Right.
You had to go physically to a store generally to use those federal subsidies. But because of the emergency conditions, now people are able, like, the rest of us are able to order groceries or produce online. And so that's been another major change in a lot of the food system work in the U.S., I think, because of the pandemic.
Yeah, great point. Yeah. We have a significant amount of funding for a farm incubator project in our city where the Farm Alliance of Baltimore has already started to train the next generation of BIPOC urban farmers. And so I will say that, now over the next several years when this money needs to be implemented and spent, that this is will be taking up our team's time pretty much full time. So, the pandemic continues to shift our work, but I think in a positive way. But also, I'll just add one thing is that we, often were focused before the pandemic on attracting and retaining grocery stores in healthy food priority areas in our city. And I think as a result of the pandemic, we realized that there will never be a grocery store in every neighborhood where we and the residents of Baltimore would like one. So we're now, taking more of a holistic approach to our entire food system, and none of the $11 million of new funding is directed towards grocery stores.
Thanks. So Latha, you were also, the emergency situation changed some of your work, and you were in some ways sort of forced into some of that. And also, I think maybe it evolved a bit, and Taylor was describing some of that feedback loop from residents. So can you tell us a little bit about what the pandemic looked like for you in New Haven, and how that's helping or not helping maybe your direction moving forward?
Yeah, so in New Haven, again, we're a very small city, and also the division had never been allocated a budget from the city. So truly, it was just my position that was funded. And through the pandemic, yes, I was, asked to help with a lot of emergency food distribution. Thankfully, right before the pandemic, in an effort to kind of have systems coordination, we, along with community partners, it really led by one community partner, and I was heavily involved in creating a network of the pantries and soup kitchens and other emergency food providers and those who support emergency food providers. And we had already started meeting and creating a steering committee. So because that existed, I was able to have a group of people to work with and we all have close relationships. And this helped because that's all to say that there were capacity issues. It was just me, but then they were like, distribute food to all the 140,000 residents.
And a skill set issue, right?
Yeah.
Like Taylor talked about, this wasn't the it's a different set, it's a different skill set, logistics,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, I'm not, I wasn't trained to and am, sometimes I don't enjoy, but then also, it takes me more time to like do all these like logistics and things like that. Thankfully, the person that's on the team with me right now had just started part-time, and she was very amazing. We worked together. She was able to handle the logistics while I handled kind of like the piece of developing relationships, contacting all the people that need to be contacted. And we developed a cool program where we worked with restaurants who provided affordable meals that the city paid for to be delivered to hotels where people who are experiencing homelessness, they were decompressed from congregate shelters, and then they were, basically like told that they have to be in rooms individually. This separated them from being able to either purchase food where they normally purchase it or go to soup kitchens and food pantries. So that was a really cool, and it's not like, some new idea. I know Cambridge in Massachusetts had done it. I'm sure many places in the U.S. had also done that as well.
And how did that, what was some of the feedback, and how did that program change as it grew and evolved throughout the pandemic?
Yeah, and so that really, we leverage our relationships with food businesses because of the focus that we have. And, we also focus, it's a very similar portfolio to what you mentioned, Ruby, where we focus on urban ag, equitable food-oriented development supporting food businesses, and the good food purchasing program around food procurement. But we leveraged those relationships, and it only strengthened those relationships as time went on through the pandemic. But because of this capacity issue and now like statewide supply chain issues were coming up, even on the state level, the Connecticut Department of Agriculture was the one that was called to do the emergency food relief efforts in the state. So then they reached out to me, and now finally I was like getting in touch with the agriculture people. This actually motivated them to like finally speak to me. And even though I had been like, hey, I want to do more urban, support more urban ag initiatives in New Haven, let's get started. Because maybe, in contrast, in New Haven, there's been a lot of community food system advocacy, but it's very focused on emergency food, like almost exclusively. So, but that's not what people are saying. It's just because those people that have proximity to power and kind of are part of these like nonprofit industrial complex, they focus on that purely. But it's, as Ruby and Taylor both said, they're like around land tenure. People are asking for this, but those are not the voices that are being heard as much. So, in response to the pandemic, I was able to get into more conversations where it's like, well, this is happening, but it's because this wasn't in place already, like infrastructure, like cold storage and that kind of stuff. And if we had relationships through procurement, we could have tapped into that during emergency food distribution and worked with even more food businesses and had land where people were already growing food for themselves in the community. And we had zoning policies that allowed you to sell food from your home. And so we were able to, from having zero budget to securing some of the first federal grants out of the new Office of Urban Ag at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, several state grants, now that the Department of Agriculture was paying attention, and some private funding. And we have nearly $1 million in funding now, so I was able to expand the team and focus on a lot of the upstream stuff. So now we've moved into this upstream work. We actually don't do, we sit on steering committees for emergency food distribution, but have now happily moved into this upstream work. And as you heard our mayor speaking, I think another thing is that our division kind of flies under the radar. I think we have non-controversial work. We have a lot of issue around gun violence and people who are experiencing homelessness, and because we're a small city, that's really a lot of where the focus goes. And these are intersecting issues with the food system, and so now a lot of my focus goes into just internally trying to connect, with housing and connecting all these issues so that our work continues to be elevated. So that's a little bit of what happened during the pandemic.
Thank you so much. Well, I'd love to, we've got just a few minutes left, don't want to go too long, but would love, if it's possible, to get the lights up for our colleagues here, and would love to open it up to questions from you all. Please. Yeah, please.
No worries. You mentioned about paying community leaders for gathering, for taking part in these committees and so on. And you also mentioned food stamps. So I was wondering if you didn't match both, or if there are some experiences about paying people in food stamps, but for healthy food, because I don't know much about food stamps, but I guess this is just about buying food, right? Not particularly healthy food or, sustaining urban agriculture or whatsoever. So I was wondering if we could not gather these things together, or if you heard about some experience, or if you drove some of them. Thank you.
Yeah, I think for the most part, a lot of the structure that we're moving towards is, to Latha's point earlier, of thinking of our community members more like consultants, right? And so even if you have issues with accessing food, we want to give you the agency to spend the money how you want to spend the money. So there's lots of exploration of what does it look like to give citizens money to have more flexibility, to spend it on things that are in alignment for them. We actually have two kind of versions of food stamps in the United States. So there's SNAP and then there's WIC, so it's women, infants, and children. And WIC is actually set up where it's a voucher that prescribes you food. The participation in WIC is very low in Illinois and across the country, but very low in Illinois. And I actually used to work in WIC and provide those services to families directly, and they don't like the prescribed foods, right? They want the flexibility to spend money on whatever they want to spend their money on food with. And so I like giving the agency to our community members in the same way that I get a salary. I want to make sure that our community members are getting a salary for the work that they do. So I think it's an interesting idea of blending the two things, but really, I would not want to be paid in apples, right? And so I want to make sure that our community members are getting dollars to have that agency.
Maybe I'll quickly just say that goes back to who's defining what healthy is, because I strongly believe that it's not my role to define. I mean, yes, I know there's especially Ruby. I mean, you know, because you have a nutrition background, right? Yep. Yeah. So there is the science of nutrition, but still though, it's who defined that nutrition and where you're learning it. So I think that's also a big, or I don't know if it's a big conversation, but it's a conversation among people who are more progressive probably about who is defining healthy, right? Because, for me culturally, my food culture is actually, very informed by my parents' culture because they're immigrants. And so, I love South Indian food. And so when I went to a dietitian, they were telling me to like eat, they're like, eat whatever. And I was like, this is not what I eat. I will not enjoy life if I'm like forced to eat this. Please, let's like figure out something that fits with my food culture so that I can also do what I believe is healthy for me. It matches, nutritional science, but then also is like enjoyable and like, I feel like I'm thriving.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about collaboration. From my experience in COVID, it brought all sorts of different parties to the table around food in new and unusual ways that, hopefully is going to have lasting changes. So I was wondering in your communities what you found from collaboration, if there's anything you learned from that.
Sure. So I would say our team, because we had already for many years been very focused on interagency collaboration at the city level, that's really what allowed us to hit the ground running with our emergency food response, because we already had existing relationships with folks and, to help with the Department of Transportation, Department of Housing and Community Development, on and on and on. But where the pandemic really made a difference is, like I talked about, we worked with probably close to 200 large and small nonprofit, primarily community organizations, churches, neighborhood associations all across the city. And we have really built relationships with the staff and the volunteers at those sites over now the last 2.5 years. And we continue to, now we will work with them way more going forward on, creating new plans, getting resident feedback through them, et cetera, than we ever did before the pandemic. And one example of that is our department as a whole right now is creating a new comprehensive plan for the city of Baltimore. And so, of course, food is only a small part of that plan. But there's the connections that our team has made is really allowing the team working on the comprehensive plan to tap into those relationships across the city.
And I think to add to that point, it's thinking about how we can keep the collaboration going kind of post-pandemic. And so I think the food leaders who kind of drove the work to the Food Equity Council really knew that we needed a structure where it was this private-public partnership. So all of the co-leads for our work group, there's a city department and a community member who drive the work. We make sure that city departments are kind of sprinkled throughout all of the working groups so that there's ownership at the city level, but then that community members are also driving it. But I think the key piece is like thinking about that structure moving forward so you can sustain that collaboration when it no longer feels like an emergency.
And I think one other point that we focus on a lot in New Haven, again, maybe because of the smaller city piece, is that we also are we're trying to overcome barriers around gatekeeping. So even for me, when you asked the question, you said paying food community leaders. We are even trying to go beyond that to pay and work with residents who aren't in those, people don't recognize them as like leaders in the community, because a lot of the leaders and kind of like self-organized groups, a lot of the nonprofits, just by nature of how these things work, they kind of funnel decision-making and power and then become gatekeepers themselves, because there's a lot of, there's like ego and personal gain. And, I am a gatekeeper too. We're all gatekeepers, but, just having the, being intentional and then also having the insight to understand that, wait, am I kind of making a decision here that's not in line with, you may not agree, but if it's, depending on the decision-making process you have, if it's consensus or majority, then that's also important too, I think, with the collaboration piece, just around the gatekeeping and just, trying to manage that, I don't know if there's like a complete solution, but.
All right, well, I think you want to ask one last, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, my question was exactly concerning these issues of gatekeeping. I wanted to know the residents that participate in the advisory committees, what's the expectation around their roles? Are they there to share their personal perspectives and to have, so that you can have, a maximum of different perspectives from people in the community? Or are they expected to like represent their community and represent like a consensus in that community on a given issue, and what's the mechanism in that case for them to make sure that what they're saying to you is in fact representative of what other people think.
I can quickly answer. In our community advisory board, we have residents who are speaking on behalf of themselves, and then to address the issue of well, we're not talking to everyone in every place. For the first year, we worked with our community advisory board. This is a 3-year process. And, we've been having monthly meetings and talking about policy, getting everyone on the same page with language and food systems kind of framings and how we can all talk to each other about these topics. Then this next year, we just started in September, we're having community-wide meetings. So we're going primarily in the disinvested communities.
But you're physically going there. You're not asking people to come to you.
Exactly. Yeah, we're usually having the meetings in schools or other places that community members feel comfortable going to. And then we're having meetings there, and we're canvassing. So we're actually out in communities, and we canvass. Mostly it's Kimberly, my colleague, who's doing this work because she manages the Urban Ag Master Planning process, canvassing at least 30 hours before each community meeting. So we have flyers and other things in 8 languages, and we provide translation and interpretation of materials and live interpretation in all meetings. And this is something the city has never, absolutely ever done. There are barely materials in 2 languages. We did 8 because we used the most commonly spoken languages in schools, and we used that as our top 8. And so, yeah, that overcomes the just having a few people. We're trying to get more people.
But you're really looking at any type of barrier to participation, whether it's physical proximity, language, time, money, all of those things you're really trying to address, which is amazing. Anybody else want to touch?
I mean, I think it's such a great question. And what's really hard, or what can be really easy to do, especially with a council, is to think, I have a Latinx perspective, check, and this person now speaks for this community. And so I think it's really important to know that that person represents themselves, and you're getting feedback from them, and this is going to be a collaborative, and we want to make sure that it's a diverse number of perspectives at the table, but that we don't want to give the responsibility of someone for being the voice for the South and West Side, for example, in Chicago, right? That can be problematic very easily. And to your point, how can someone represent an entire community? And it's a balance. And part of it is I have to take ownership that we're not gonna be perfect. So a lot of times I have to own that the Food Equity Council is not gonna be perfectly equitable, right? And that's part of the work. But I think the most important thing is giving those community members who typically aren't invited to come to the mayor's office and shape things an opportunity to sit at the table. And we're doing work, so we're shaping policy together. And so you're bringing your critical thinking skills and your lived experience to inform what this policy looks like.
All right, well, please join me in a big round of applause for these wonderful panelists. Thank you all so much. Thank you for your questions. Please come up and introduce yourselves if you don't know them already. And thank you so much for being here.